Shannon, hi.
Hi, Johan. How are you?
I'm great. How are you doing?
All right. So this week, it's all about India and Africa.
It is indeed, and specifically what Africa can learn from India's fintech revolution over the past decade.
That's right. The inspiration for this conversation was a terrific blog post that explored two regions where Quona invests and the differences between them in terms of their tech stack. I'm lucky enough to know the authors well. It was written by you, my friend Johan, and another of our colleagues, Adrienne Henderson.
Thanks, Shannon. Adrienne recently spent time on the ground examining the fintech stack in India and had a lot of ideas on how to cross-pollinate the success of India with Africa.
And, when we look at India, we see a country that has built in really just a few short years what many consider to be the world's most sophisticated digital financial infrastructure.
Meanwhile, Africa has some incredible financial innovation of its own. But this diverse region faces challenges, namely scaling solutions across a continent with 54 countries, more than 40 central banks, and somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 languages.
Oof, 54 countries, 41 central banks, thousands of languages. I can absolutely see how that makes fintech at scale difficult.
Yes, it really does. But that doesn't mean it's impossible.
And this week on the $1 Trillion Opportunity, we're exploring what parts of India's playbook can be adapted to build a thriving tech ecosystem in Africa.
And we're joined by Adrienne Henderson, a senior associate at Quona Capital.
All right, let's start with a number that highlights the scale of what we're talking about.
In 2023, India accounted for nearly 25% of all global IPOs. That's about 340 public offerings in a single country. Meanwhile, the entire Middle East and Africa region combined had around 50 IPOs, and most weren't even tech companies.
Well, so what about sub-Saharan Africa and Central Africa in that number? Where do they fall?
Well, then it's even less, actually. It's only 2 meaningful IPOs for the entire 2024 happened in sub-Saharan Africa and Central Africa combined.
Ugh. That single statistic shows just how far ahead India's tech ecosystem is in terms of building and exiting large companies compared to Africa. But it wasn't always this way, was it?
No, it was not.
I think what's so interesting about India is that, not long ago, it was also quite a nascent market with mostly foreign investment. Everyone was trying to figure out India.
Interestingly enough, this change came largely from one solution: individual identity verification. In a country of 1.4 billion people, one nation was able to develop a central identity system for literally everybody. And this unlocked access to meaningful financial services for everyone.
Well, just starting with digital identity, right? Aadhaar in India was something that I didn't know about, and it kind of blew me away. Like 1.3 billion people on the same, biometric digital ID system completely reduces friction in banking, government services, even travel. Hearing some stories like on the ground of people forgetting their IDs and just being able to walk through a domestic airport. I mean, we don't have that in the US.
So the second foundation was UPI, India's Unified Payments Interface, which enables instant, low-cost digital payments across the entire country.
UPI enabling instant payments is definitely a huge contributor to making money flow and a platform on which you can then build innovative companies and solutions.
And the third piece was open APIs, a layer that required banks to create the ability for others to build on top of this enabling infrastructure. So if we look at Africa, how does the situation compare to what we see in India? What infrastructure exists already, and what do you guys think is still needed?
Africa is much harder. As I mentioned earlier, I believe it was just the reality of 54 countries, more than 3,000 languages. Everyone's got different currencies or many different currencies, inconsistent infrastructure. It's just so much harder to build something across Africa as a result. It's not impossible, but I do think we need to have a unified view of the future and then build towards that as a collective.
So let's start with a deeper look at digital ID systems in Africa. Unlike India, where they have Aadhaar, the digital identification system, there is no single identity system on the continent of Africa. Adrienne, you were recently in Nigeria. What's the situation there with digital identity, just as a single use case?
Nigeria has one of the fastest growing populations in Africa, if not the fastest. And they are still trying to figure out an ID system just for Nigeria. And the BVN system is what's widely used right now as their kind of de facto digital ID.
The BVN construct is a really interesting one. Industry-led, it's become in many ways a de facto way of proving your identity. I have a BVN, so it stands for a bank verification number. And it's relatively easy to get, but it's very smart in that you're just tapping into a tool that everyone will have to get if they want to open a bank account of any kind, right? So once you've done it once, it can then be utilized again and again.
It shows that, at least in that case, an industry-led approach can scale quickly, but there's no interoperability across systems, across borders, no harmonized ID infrastructure.
Digital identification is just one part of the foundation for any thriving tech ecosystem. But another piece is the infrastructure that actually supports the flow of money from one person to another. Now, we've seen wildly successful payment rails like UPI in India and Pix in Brazil, but both of those were supported by their governments. What payment rails are you seeing in Africa?
In Africa, we can probably look at something like M-Pesa, which obviously is very different. It came from a very different place, born from industry, in this case, from Safaricom, in that it made the flow of money really easy. And as a result, we've seen a number of very innovative companies launching in East Africa and in Kenya. Why? Because it's very easy to move money around. It's very cheap as well, which suddenly means you can then build innovative businesses on top of fast, instant payments.
We take the fact that people know what M-Pesa is and how revolutionary it is for granted. When I moved to Kenya, I had never heard of M-Pesa before, and I was absolutely blown away by M-Pesa. I think it's one of the most seamless systems I've ever come across. And so maybe just explaining it for people who don't understand, because even in the US, a lot of my friends will say when I go abroad, oh, how do you send money to each other? Do you use Venmo? And in a lot of instances, it's hard to explain that you don't need Venmo, actually, in other countries, where you can just send money mobile to mobile from your phone to phone without needing to on-ramp, off-ramp, you can send money to your Venmo, send the Venmo to someone else, and then take the money out of your Venmo. In M-Pesa, it's direct phone to phone, direct to vendors. And I think for a lot of people who haven't seen it up close, it's actually hard to conceptualize how M-Pesa is ingrained in every part of life. If you go to buy something from a street vendor, you can use an M-Pesa ID number in your phone instead of having to take out cash, use a credit card, use a payment terminal. And that just leapfrogged a lot of the traditional things that had to happen first in other countries, like in the US.
I would love to have M-Pesa in the U.S., honestly, real-time
exactly.
payments. That would be such a game changer.
Yeah.
It's a good point Adrienne makes around M-Pesa and actually how it works. It is seamless and it really touches almost everyone in the country. What is interesting, though, is the success of M-Pesa is based on still getting money in and money out. And I think what is quite unique in this instance is how they got that right, by having a very large number of agents who were selling airtime. This could be someone who is a small store on the side of the road, or someone who focused on being a airtime salesperson, essentially running a small agency of their own, who then became mobile money agents overnight, where you could then accept real money and exchange it for, in this case, mobile money. So they become essentially a network of human ATMs, if you will, which really has been a real success within the mobile money ecosystem, is this ability to seamlessly get money in for digital money or mobile money. And then when someone needs cash, they can do exactly the same.
Despite all its success, M-Pesa hasn't completely eliminated cash in Kenya. In fact, the majority of transactions in Kenya are still made in cash in spite of M-Pesa. So why is that?
In this case, one or two weaknesses would be price of transaction. So for very low transaction sizes, there's a price every time a mobile money transaction is processed. And I don't think it's at the point that people are incentivized to use it for micro transactions. Their cash is still seen as a free capability where if I transfer $1 equivalent, the other person receives $1. There still is a reality of my money doesn't run out of battery. So if my phone goes flat, I can still transact if I have cash.
Yeah, that's fair.
So there's definitely an element of that where charging patterns in emerging markets, I think, are very different. You might have homes that don't have power and they can't charge their phones every night like we do. Mm-hmm. So I do think there's an element of that as well. And then there's part of it would be this idea of cash transactions are invisible to other parties. So, if I transact digitally entirely, does that mean that I need to pay more tax? Government has a view of all my transactions, and maybe I don't necessarily want that. Part of that could be tax avoidance. Part just could be I would like my anonymity.
South Africa already has a real-time payment platform that they launched in 2023. Johan, can you share a little bit about the Rapid Payments program, since you yourself are living there in South Africa and know a lot about it?
So the Rapid Payment Program was developed as a collaborative effort with the SARB, South African Reserve Bank, and BankServe, as well as the major commercial banks who were all involved. So I think that's an important point here, is there has been buy-in from the banks to say we are going to build this capability together. It only launched, like I said, about 2 years ago. I saw some numbers a year ago. They'd processed over 30 million transactions. And what's quite interesting about this platform is it actually does have a few instances of looking a bit like M-Pesa, in the fact that your PayShap ID, which is the ID that everyone has to register for, is your phone number. So it's your mobile number. So essentially, I can send money to you just by knowing what your mobile number is. And as long as you're a member, and if you're not, by the way, you just simply become one, and then you can accept and receive payments. So it's instant payments using mobile numbers as an identifier, but it's still a bank-to-bank transaction. And as the name obviously says, it is much faster.
Part of, I think, what we're seeing there with the success in India and the strength of its ecosystem for venture and for startups is this incredible pool of talent, right? Locally in India, there to, make big strides. What investments in Africa's human capital do you think, both of you, would make or break an infrastructure revolution across the continent? What do you think Africa needs in terms of its people?
First, I agree with you that talent is kind of everything. In India, much of the kind of India stack was built by pro bono engineers through iSpirit and other networks. So the amount of talent contribution to making this successful was huge. So I went to India, and then I went to Cape Town for a couple of weeks with Johan. And one of the things I was most blown away by was the amount of talent in South Africa. We went to these events for founders and entrepreneurs and investors, and there were hundreds of people there. And this is completely different to how it was when I was there even a decade ago, particularly with Cape Town versus Johannesburg. And I think that Africa has incredible technical talent, but it needs more investment in education, particularly digital higher education, open source collaboration tools, which India had a lot of, and kind of enabling local technology talent to shape infrastructure, not just build on top of it.
Definitely. Johan, any thoughts to add?
I totally agree. I don't think we have a talent problem in Africa. I think we have incredible talent across the continent. We're seeing these fintech hubs emerge for good reason in certain markets more than others, not because of a lack of talent in some of the other markets. It's more market size. Not every business should be venture-backed. Venture requires someone to build a scale business, something that can be really category defining and large. And for that, you need a large customer audience, right? You need lots of people who are willing to pay for your service. So naturally, the money has flowed into countries like South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, and Egypt, because they are very large markets in comparison to some of the other smaller markets. And when it comes to financial services, the ability to be Pan-African is much harder, because now, again, as we said, you have multiple countries where you have to get licenses in different countries, different regulatory environments, different competitive environments.
So let's get practical a little bit. If you're running a fintech startup in Africa today, how do you navigate building in an infrastructure that's still evolving? Are you waiting for better rails? Are you building your own? What do you think the fintech solution is? If you're a startup founder in Africa, what are your thoughts?
Wow, tricky. It's a great question. I think the best founders I've met do a bit of both. They build with existing rails in mind while architecting for future infrastructure. I think what we've seen work well is building with existing rails, with future infrastructure in mind, working around bottlenecks, but staying close to regulators. So I think where we've seen things not work well is when people keep regulatory as in the back of their head instead of the front of their head. It should be, right at the forefront.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. And increasingly building partnerships with infrastructure providers rather than trying to, fully replace them. So being, an orchestration layer, for example, or being integrated with some existing rails, I think works well. So it's kind of the dance between innovation and integration, but those who do it well are the ones that are, actually changing how fintech is done.
We're seeing some companies building incredible tech using AI tools where you don't need to build a large team to really build something meaningful. It's really this efficiency that you get from AI, which wasn't there 5 years ago.
So what is the outlook here? What does the future hold for Africa's tech ecosystem?
In our role as investors, I think there's a lot about helping to develop the ecosystem that we can do in terms of trying to help investments that catalyze investment in foundational systems like digital identity and interoperable payment systems that we keep mentioning, catalyzing local capital. So we ourselves obviously are on the ground there, but co-investing with other, local VCs, trying to make sure that we're creating an environment that's easy for local LPs to invest, like pension funds, African GPs, et cetera, and embracing kind of those public-private partnerships. So making sure that when we are talking to people who are building in the space, that we encourage them to work with governments that are laying the groundwork for these kind of regional systems and thinking regionally, not just nationally. So I think it's great where South Africa is right now, and Nigeria and Kenya, and Egypt, these are countries that you can invest in and the market is big enough. But if the goal is to have a continent-wide interoperable system, then trying to invest in companies that will have Pan-African solutions or regional solutions, I think is definitely something to keep in mind as well.
I like the angle of thinking as an ecosystem where we can't succeed on our own, just like no one else can. And the successes that we're going to see in terms of some of the successful companies that have been funded that are providing really impactful solutions to their users that one day will be sold or bought for a large amount of money will fuel further success, because then more capital flows into emerging markets overall, or into Africa in this case. I think the capital stack is important as well. We play at a particular stage, so pre-Series A, Series A, but there's a need for early stage capital. There's a need for growth capital. There's a need for obviously liquidity and exits and strategic acquirers. And that is where I think all investors can play a role, is building out that ecosystem, fostering those relationships, making sure that we are supporting early stage funds to help raise capital, because again, we need it for building a pipeline of opportunities for us, and then building relationships with downstream capital to make sure companies can get that really important growth capital to get to the next stage, which then gives everyone a venture style return. And as we know, success breeds success. So as an ecosystem, I'm very encouraged by the amount of collaboration in the ecosystem. It seems to be more collaborative than it is competitive. What we do know is that there's some lessons from India that we can definitely incorporate into the conversations we're having in different sectors, different countries, etc. And the reality is that the answer will come through dialogue. And I think I'm encouraged by the fact that there are a number of initiatives, there are a number of conversations happening between different groups, whether it be private companies, governments, regulators. Those conversations are happening, and I think they're going to now begin to accelerate. So again, we don't think the answer is, or the solution will come in the next year or two, but there definitely is an acceleration of intent, which is really important, as well as now lessons from different markets that we can draw on. So sometimes we need to let these things take time.
And that's all for this episode of The $1 Trillion Opportunity.
You can follow The $1 Trillion Opportunity on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
The $1 Trillion Opportunity is produced by Quona and Pod People. Our producers are Danielle Roth, Julie Bilewski, and Hannah Patterson. Carter Wogan and David DeLuca edit the show. Special thanks to my hero, Rachel King, and Amy Machado.
Thanks, Shannon. We'll be back soon for more insights from founders and investors building the future of fintech in emerging markets.
You won't want to miss it.